Hi there, I'm Jacques Gadway, professional violinist, and I thought it would be fun if today I went onto the subreddit Violinist and answered some questions. Let's start with a very relevant post on this subreddit that I really like and I think is a great way to kick us off. This one says, from a Reddit user, "Turns out that playing scales and arpeggios does improve your playing. Devastated. I've been playing very crappily as of late, with some very poor intonation. In violin terms, I had let myself go, and avoided playing scales and arpeggios for far too long. So I decided to dedicate playing scales and arpeggios at the beginning of every practice. And what do you know? I am actually improving. Terrible news for the scales-hating community, but alas, my violin slump has come to an end, and I feel like I'm making progress again." This is such an accurate sentiment, and I think really important to see on this violin subreddit, so I'm happy to see that somebody has posted it, mostly because this is absolutely true. I always tell my students that practicing scales and arpeggios is extremely important and actually really does help your playing. There's a couple reasons for this that I'd like to point out. The first is that, well, most music that we learn does in fact use scales and arpeggios at the heart of its composition, which means that if you practice scales and arpeggios, that skill which you build through that practice is transferable, and you can just carry it over into all sorts of repertoire. The second, less obvious reason that scales and arpeggios are so useful is because, well, they're the same thing over and over again. Over your career as a violinist, you'll get to learn these scales and arpeggios like they're the back of your hand. And as a result, you get to use them to superimpose different techniques that you want to build based off of your skill level or things that you're struggling with that you want to work on. I think that the scale book from Carl Flesch has a great example of this being put into place. If you ever flipped through the scale book, which I hope you have, you'll see that on every single page or every single scale, there will be a new bowing or a new place in the bow to play in. That doesn't mean that for that specific scale you have to play in that part of the bow. It just gives you all these different opportunities to use these different bow strokes, different placements in the bow, and different techniques, and you're free to use those on any of the scales. So because scales and arpeggios become so rote, you now get to expand your focus and employ all sorts of new techniques that you want to work on. You don't always have to play scales and arpeggios as long whole notes that you make sure are in tune. Ideally, you're always playing in tune, but a lot of practice is going to be missing the mark. But what you can do is you can incorporate new rhythms, new bowings, new techniques. One of my favorite things to do is employ rhythms in my scales, as it really helps lighten the fingers. You can look to some of Sevcek's books for this kind of inspiration. Another Reddit user just asked a simple question to the community: what's your favorite song to play on the violin recently? Well, there's a lot of great songs to play. Most of my work these days comes in the form of playing covers of popular music. But in reality, one of my favorite things to play over and over again is to revisit Bach, specifically his E major partita. In the next Reddit post, we see that one Reddit user asks this question: apps to check fingering intonation? Just starting to learn, and I'm having issues with intonation. The tape that I have placed doesn't seem to help much because of my fat fingers. Does anyone know any good desktop apps that I can have listen to my playing and show when I am off pitch on the note? I have found tuning apps, but they are focused on the open strings. Phone apps are okay too, but it's harder to view the screen and adjust finger placement as I play. Well, this is a very interesting question, and I think it highlights several issues with beginners and starting off learning good intonation and finger placement. The question is asking for an app, but I don't think that the solution is necessarily within an app. I think the most important solution is to understand the difference between the tape and the reality of finger placement. When you have tape on an instrument upon the fingerboard, it's important to remember what that tape represents. If you have a tape where your first finger should go, for example, it's important to realize that that doesn't necessarily mean that you put your first finger anywhere on or around that tape. there's a very specific placement that you'll need to place that first finger. And if when doing this placement, the note is still out of tune, then it's an issue of where your tape is placed. So I would make sure your open strings are first in tune. Then I would make sure that upon placing your first finger in the correct place on the tape, that note is in tune with a tuner. And if you're curious about a tuner app, my favorite that I use is linked below. It's Tonal Energy Tuner, which I use on my phone daily. So all this talk about the correct finger placement based off of the tape. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that when you have a tape on your fingerboard, it's important to remember what our finger is doing. The reason that when we place our finger on the string, it changes the pitch is because we are effectively changing the length of the string. The reason that's important to understand is because that gives us insight into what about our finger placement makes our pitch in tune or out of tune. If the goal of our placement of our finger is to shorten the string, then that means that the furthest most point of our finger, the very edge, in other words, the last place the finger touches before the string starts to vibrate, that is where our exact finger placement is. It doesn't matter where the center of mass is on the finger, it only matters where the edge of the finger lands. So with that being said, your tapes should be placed in such a way that when you place your finger right on the tape so that the edge of your finger covers it, just barely, that is where the note should be in tune. If you find that the note is not in tune, that simply means that you need to change the placement of your tape. Be careful when you're using tape in playing violin that you don't simply aim with the center of mass of your finger on the tape, because the center of mass of your finger is not where the note will sound. We are making differences in pitch based off of how short or long we make the string. And how short or long we make the string will always be the last place of contact, which is the furthest down, or in other words, the closest part of your finger to the bridge that's touching the string. Another part of this question that's important to realize is that when you're using tuner apps, or any kind of tuner, those apps are going to be tuned to equal temperament, which is the tuning of a piano. However, our violins resonate without equal temperament. They resonate sympathetically with themselves. In other words, if we play a D natural on the A string perfectly in tune, that's going to be our third finger, it's going to be a different D natural than, let's say, our tuner will pick up, or let's say the piano will sound. But it will sound beautifully in tune because it will be perfectly in tune with our open D. And it's more important for us to be in tune with ourselves when we're playing alone than it is for us to match a tuner. So I wouldn't focus so much on using a tuner in your practice. In fact, the best thing to do when doing intonation practice is to practice with something called a drone. I like to use Cello Drones, and you can find those in a link on YouTube and or Spotify, which I'll leave below. Lastly, the most important thing about intonation work and building a good left hand is to not move your finger around. I look back at this Reddit user's question and I notice one key issue. Phone apps are okay too, but it's harder to view the screen and adjust finger placement as I play. This is a big issue when you're trying to develop a good left hand. Beware of over-relying on smearing your finger across the fingerboard. It's really important when you're trying to develop a good left-hand finger technique that you learn how to place your fingers in the correct place. That means if you're working on intonation and you want to place a note in tune, when you place it and it's incorrect, let's say I've placed my first finger and it's sharp. It's sharp. Instead of smearing my finger down to a flat position, what you'll notice when I do that is it deforms my finger, first of all, and it also does not teach my body how to place the finger. Our muscle memory is only built through repetition. So the only way to learn how to place the finger in the correct place is to place it in the correct place. So that means if you place it in the wrong place, the solution is not to smear it, but rather is to lift it, use the information you've gained from the tuner, whether you're sharp or flat, and replace it with an adjustment in mind. The next question is a really quick one. We see an image here from what looks like a Flesch book, and it just says fingering confusion. And you can see here in the image that we have 3, 4, 3, 4, 3, 4, 3, 4. That seems quite silly if you think about it, using third finger, fourth finger, third finger, fourth finger. But this is exactly what I mentioned earlier when we talk about why practicing scales are so important. This is from the second reason of why they can be so beneficial, which is that once you know a scale, you have it in your mind, in your body, you can now implement new techniques, new fingerings even, in order to help develop technique based off of your needs. Remember that scales and etudes should serve you. In this case, based off of the fingerings here that look kind of funny, it's clearly meant to build up the strength and flexibility and agility in our third and fourth fingers, fingers that are generally thought to be weaker than the first and second. So I would use this scale and fingering if I were feeling like I wanted to build up my strength in my third and fourth finger. Moving on to the next question. This one is pretty close to my heart. This one I hear all the time from students, and especially adult students, and it appears that that's what we see here. Worth it if I can't practice daily? Hey, absolute newbie here, picking up violin after at least 15 years since I briefly played it when I was very young. I have my first lesson with a teacher planned right now, super excited, but keep seeing how daily practice is the most important. I just wanted to ask whether there's anyone out there that wasn't/isn't available to practice daily and how that turned out. I'm unsure on if I'm able to commit to daily practice, which was also my reason for holding off from starting, to be honest. But I think I'd really enjoy playing even if I'm not fully able to commit, quote, enough time daily. I'm probably going to just keep it as a hobby and not really go further with it than that, so I'm okay with probably learning at a slower pace and not becoming amazing. So the question here is basically asking, is it worth it? Is it worth pursuing violin if I can't practice every single day? And the answer is, it totally depends on you. The reality is, life gets really busy and it's hard to practice every single day. I can tell you for certain that I practice a lot less now than I did when I was in college, and that's simply because I have newfound responsibilities. I have new things that I have to attend to. I'm certainly playing a lot of violin, but I'm not practicing as much as I used to. The question that you have to ask yourself is, first of all, do you want to learn the violin? And it sounds like the answer is yes. The second question you want to ask yourself is, do you think it would be better to practice 2 days a week in your pursuit of becoming better at violin, or to practice no days a week? The obvious answer is always going to be to practice 2 days a week, or to practice 3 days a week, to do what you can. The worst case scenario, if your desire is to get better at violin, is to just not do it. Seems like that's what you've done for the last 15 years, so I certainly hope that you take what time you can and practice the best you can. The final question is one that I think resonates with all of us who perform at all, and this is playing for an audience. The Reddit user says, I'm taking this composition class at the community college, and I just found out that we will present our final piece in the applied music concert. Now I am taking a violin class, and I am playing in an orchestra, but the last time I played solo for an actual audience, I was 13 playing piano. I'm in my 50s now. Playing for an audience, any audience, is really, really, really hard for me. 3 weeks ago, I attended a workshop that required me to record myself, and I could not listen to myself playing for the next 2 weeks after that. I am that paralyzed at the thought of playing anything solo other than under the umbrella of, quote, I'm still working on it. I'm really happy to practice. This thing will happen in early December. How do I even start to prepare for it? I have not even started working on the final piece, and I still have my choice of instrument. Either the piano that carries a lot of baggage for me, or the violin, but I'm still a novice. Do I drop it and move to the end of the world with my violin, where I can play and nobody can hear me? I like that. Yeah, so the question here is clearly rooted around performance anxiety and how to prepare for a performance when one is uncomfortable on stage. It's easy to say, don't be nervous, but the reality is, obviously, we are social creatures, and it is nerve-wracking to play in front of people. And that's because, in part, we feel that there's a lot of judgment when we're playing in front of people. And the reality is, there may be judgment in some scenarios. But it's important to remember that people just don't care. People don't care about us very much. I know that sounds very sad to say. But people are too busy with their own lives to really care. I mean, they might be attentive during a performance, but by the time they're on their way home, they might forget everything. When you think about it in that light, you can realize the true treasure of the ephemeral nature of performance and put it all on the line. Because at the end of the day, it's only going to be on the stage at that moment. There are some exceptions to this when you have recordings that live on forever. But then there's another issue, which is that you have that recording and nobody watches it. Because again, nobody cares. Sometimes people will watch. Sometimes you'll have that great of a performance that people will watch. But at the end of the day, it's really out of your control how people interpret or intake your performance. All that is in your control is your preparation before the performance and how you end up pulling it off. So when preparing for a performance, it's important to remember that as much as you practice in the practice room, that does not necessarily help directly. Because performing in and of itself is its own skill. It's its own thing that you have to practice. You only get better at performing by performing, just like you only get better at scales by playing scales, just like you only get better at your repertoire by practicing your repertoire. In order to get better at performing, you have to perform. So you can think of this in two ways. You can see this performance as practice for future performances, and that can help take some pressure off. Or you can create situations preceding the performance that you are going to be able to play in front of people. This is the preferred option, and this is the one that I always employ when I have auditions or performances coming up that I feel a little bit nervous about. I make sure to get in front of colleagues, friends, family, and play through these pieces. What's the harm in failing or having a bad performance in front of just the people you love? They're there to support you, right? So see who you can play in front of who won't mind hearing you scratch away, and do it. You will still be nervous in that situation. You may not be nervous in your concert, but at the very least, at your concert, you will have felt that before, and you will have conquered it before. I don't think that the stage fright ever truly goes away, but we learn how to deal with it through practice. So the bottom line is, either when we have performances coming up that we're worried about, we create opportunities to exist in that kind of stress, or we treat it, the performance itself, as practice for future ones down the line. Either way, we understand that we're all growing through this process, and it's okay to feel nervous. It's okay to have it be a process. We never have to be finished in our life, at least not until we die. That's all the Reddit questions that I'm answering today. If you have any questions yourself, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. I'll be happy to get to them. It's always nice to see what people are thinking and saying in the Reddit. I hope my insight may have helped any of you that decided to watch this far. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.